Good afternoon to everyone just joining us. We will get started in just 1 minute. Looks like we're going to have a good crowd today. It's going to be a fun one. All right, those numbers are still going up. We'll give it another 30 seconds. And then we'll tee off so we make sure that we're leaving lots of time for conversation and hopefully robust Q&A. That's on you, attendees. We hope you ask good questions. Okay, I think that was a good 30 seconds. So I'm going to get things kicked off by saying welcome to another MassMedic webinar. I'm Rachel Robinson, Chief Operating Officer at MassMedic, and I'm thrilled to be joining you today for a discussion on threat modeling and risk assessment. I know for a lot of you, this is an incredibly hot topic. It's something that we think about a lot in medical devices as we work obviously very closely with FDA requirements and regulations. And if you're in the product development cycle at all, I'm sure this is something that is near and dear to your heart. I like to think I'm a risk assessment nerd of a sort. So I'm excited about what we're going to talk about today. I want to say thank you to ICS and BG Network for offering to put together this incredible program. You know, we do these webinars probably weekly at a weekly cadence these days. And so coming up with incredible topics is something that we lean so heavily on our members for. So I can't say thank you enough when folks step up and say, I'm willing to have a conversation about this for the benefit of the folks on the phone. So just really appreciative of them. A few quick housekeeping notes. You can ask questions through the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We strongly suggest that you share what's top of mind for you. The speakers will look at those and answer questions at the end. So don't be afraid that they've missed something they'll go back to it and answer the questions as you put them in the Q&A in real time. You are on mute, so no worries about silencing everything around you. And for anyone who has to jump off early, or if your colleagues couldn't join, we will be sharing the video link to this program afterwards. So you'll be able to come back and review anything that you had questions about. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Janelle to introduce our speakers, and thank you all for joining us again.
All right, great. Thanks, Rachel, and thanks, MassMedic. Like Rachel said, my name is Janelle with ICS. I'm just going to tell you a little bit about the companies here today before we begin. ICS supports our customers with software development, user experience design, platform and regulatory support to build next-generation products. We provide a number of services focused on the medtech space, including cybersecurity. And joining us today, we have BG Networks. BG makes products that automate cybersecurity for medical devices. This includes cybersecurity test automation and cyber attack detection. And from ICS, we have my colleague, Milton Yarberry. He is the Director of Medical Programs for ICS. And from BG Networks, we have Colin Duggan, the founder and CEO, and Dr. Roman Lysecki, who is the CTO. And to stay connected with today's speakers, simply scan the QR codes you see on the screen here. Each code will take you directly to their LinkedIn profile. So feel free to follow, connect, and keep the conversation going after the webinar. We'll put these back up at the end, again, for your convenience. Okay, and this is just one webinar in a series we've been doing. I think we have about 6 now since early 2024. And we've included the other previous webinars here, so you can view on demand if you haven't already. Lots of good topics here, and if you'd like to see any other topics, please feel free to put it in the chat, and we will consider it as we go forward with this series. So I am going to pass it over to Colin now to go into some more details about today's agenda.
Great, Janelle, thank you very much. And just a note here, the next two we're considering in our series is AI and cybersecurity for medical devices is one. Another is FDA and MDR addressing both with a single effort. So if you think those are interesting or one or the other, just let us know. And here's the agenda for today. And Milton's going to start us off. Why should threats be modeled and risks be assessed? It's going to set us up nicely for the context with context for the example that we're going to show. He'll get into talking about threat and risk assessments in terms of what the FDA expects, in terms of the life cycle of your medical devices, and also this question about safety and security, and how do they overlap and how do you get them to interact with one another. I will take us through the example we're going to show today. It's a threat and risk assessment example. And this is the point where we've been joking that this is man versus the machine. So just before I start the example, Roman's going to kick off a AI automation tool that we offer called MITRE. And we're going to see how well the AI does versus my natural intelligence. And we'll see who comes out better at the end. Roman, who's your money on? Is it on me or is it on the machine?
I'm going to go with machine.
Yeah, that's probably a safe bet. And then Roman at the end is going to show you the complete threat and risk analysis. The one that I'll do in the example will be complete in terms of showing you all the steps in the process, in terms of the assets, the threats, the damage scenarios, the impacts, the attack paths, and rating of the risks ultimately. So we'll go through a complete example for you so you'll get a good understanding of the process and how to go through it. And then Roman at the end will show you what a complete one looks like. We are offering one-on-one sessions. So if you have questions in more depth, Janelle's going to put a Calendly link in the chat here. And please, if you're interested, find a time on the Calendly, and we'd be happy to sit down and dive into detail and even talk about threat modeling and risk assessments for your specific device. Oh, and this is the working session. I jumped ahead here. Here's the Calendly link. And I think, again, Janelle will put that in the chat. So we have a poll question, and it's just to get a little bit of sense of where people are. I suspect that there'll probably be kind of a wide distribution. But the poll question is for you to answer now, if you don't mind. And the question is, what aspects of threat modeling risk assessments do you already know? And it ranges from the multiple choice answers, A, which you're new to the process. Threat modeling is done for all types of devices, but maybe you've never done it for a medical device before. Maybe you're familiar with medical devices, but you haven't done a risk assessment. And maybe you're familiar with the whole process and the iterations between safety and security and the multiple iterations. For instance, if you were getting ready for a 510K, you need to come back to the threat and risk assessment 3 or 4 times, because you'll do it in the beginning, ideally. It's going to really help you figure out the sort of security you need to design in from the beginning of your development of your medical device. You'll come back to it again after there's an SBOM analysis done and vulnerabilities found potentially from the SBOM analysis. You'd want to look at those vulnerabilities, put them back into your threat model and risk assessment to determine if they need to be addressed. You'll do penetration testing. That will find vulnerabilities. You'll come back again. And then the FDA also requires unresolved functional anomalies that may impact security to be analyzed. And that would be another time that you come back to the threat and risk assessment. So let's see, is there a result for the poll here at this point? Okay, great. I don't know if people can see this here. I've put it on my shared screen, but maybe you can see it locally also. And it looks like about half have done risk assessments for medical devices. Great. So we have an experienced group here. Some have done threat modeling. Some are new, about 30% are new. And it looks like about 15% have been through the entire process. So I think a wide distribution like we expected. But one other thing I'll mention on this slide is the difference between threat modeling and risk assessment. Threat modeling is really the beginning step. It is going to result in a submission for a 510K into eStar. There's a specific document that the FDA requires that's a results of threat modeling, but it feeds into the risk assessment. The threats that are modeled need to be assessed for risk. So they're very connected. And I found over the years that the terminology is used interchangeably. But really, the way I think about it is the threat modeling is the front end and the risk assessment is the back end. And at the end of the day, the results of the risk assessment are going to indicate what you need to do in terms of security. Milton, I'll turn it over to you.
All right. Thanks, Colin. Yeah, so I'll be talking a little bit about sort of the context of the threat modeling and risk assessment, sort of the why, or why this needs to be done. Where I like to start with this is around the FDA's guidance that they put out in 2023. And this is just a quick excerpt or snapshot of the table of contents. And you can sort of see under the element 5 there, it gets into using SPDF or Secure Product Development Framework. And from there, it's security risk management. And then under risk management, or, these are pretty much the first two steps for risk management. And if you could advance that, please. All right, so the threat modeling is pretty much, at least in my humble opinion, foundational. I mean, it's identifying assets, you identify your threats, and it sort of gives you a diagram that, sort of pulls the room together, per se. The threat modeling supports the cybersecurity risk assessment. Advance. It's a systematic process, and the one that we'll be showing today, I believe everything is stride-based, but there are other ones out there as well, PASTA, DREAD, attack trees. And it's systematic as in it reduces bias by giving you a mechanical method to do the analysis. And by being sort of a finite process, it really helps you know when you're done. It's semi-quantifiable in terms of the scoring methods, and it integrates well with the safety risk assessment, which is really sort of where this originated from, the product risk assessment. Why is threat modeling and risk assessment needed? So one of the first arguments that I'd sort of reach for is just it's an important part of the secure but by design approach, and really this is something that you want to do at the beginning of a new medical device development. The result is you get sort of integrated solutions which are harder to defeat in your product over, say, solutions which are more sort of tacked on. They're going to be more vulnerable. Um, it identifies features that will have the biggest impact, and you can sort of use that in part of, figuring out where you put your effort, where you put your budget, that sort of thing. Also, it's required by the FDA for pre-market submission. In the E-Star, which is the FDA's system for submitting 510Ks, it's referred to as risk management threat model or risk management cybersecurity risk assessment. This basically feeds several of the E-Star requirements for 510K submission, so it's usable immediately from the time you submit. From the MDR perspective, the EU MDR, this doesn't exactly match what the FDA is doing in terms of documentation for pre-market submission. The risk management is a bit lightweight, which is why it can be supplemented with SW96 from the AMI. So when is threat modeling and risk assessment used? And the long story short is basically throughout the medical device life cycle. So of course up front when you're about to define the product and do the development, but it needs to be performed whenever threats are identified. And that can be at any point in the life cycle. And one more advance, please. And so this can also be after the product has gone to market. You should think of updating these two when, of course, when you have new product features, how they might change your attack surface and therefore require updating these assets. But also say obsolescence-driven hardware changes where you have a piece of hardware that you can't get anymore, you're replacing it, it's going to have a whole new cybersecurity profile. Of course, connectivity changes. So if you didn't have a network connection and now you do, or you have a different type of connection, or that connection goes through different types, different levels of security boundaries. Also new operating environments. So if a device was only used clinically in the hospital first, but then it was became a home device, for example, that new operating environment would require an update. And of course, as I say, SBOM-driven vulnerabilities. So as new vulnerabilities are discovered in the market and you're doing your due diligence of your device in the field, as those vulnerabilities come to light, you may have things you need to fix, and then of course you'd want to update the modeling, et cetera. So basically, this would give you a report of new critical threats, and the thing to sort of keep in mind here is the response time. As part of the requirement from the FDA is not just that you fix these things, but that the timing on the fix is sort of proportionate to the threat it poses. Towards the idea of security versus safety. So the diagram on the right there is from TIR 57, which shows kind of the classic comparison of two processes. The stack of boxes on the right is the traditional product risk management process. So kind of the traditional product safety picture. And then the stack on the left is the security risk management process. The yellow circle in the middle is where basically the security risk evaluation can transfer from the security side to the safety side and then become part of that safety process. And the other sort of salient thing here is that on each process, these are independent processes, the risk control measures that are applied can feed into the other parallel progress. So a security risk control can feed into the product safety risk analysis, and the product safety risk control can feed into the security risk analysis. So an interesting question here is if it doesn't impact patient safety, can a severe security issue really be considered a patient safety issue? And of course, the answer is it depends, and you have to take a look at security objectives, which what the FDA is looking for is authenticity, which is really about identifying the users or the endpoints. The integrity, which is that communication or information isn't corrupted or repurposed. Authorization, which is a notion of like roles and or permissions. Availability of the system, the confidentiality of protected health information or other technology secrets, and basically secure and timely software updates. Taking a look at the definition of cybersecurity risk is kind of interesting because depending on who you're working with, they can have slightly different spins on this. Looking at risk as being composed of sort of the feasibility of a problem versus the impact of it. The FDA has a nice sort of simple, compact combination here. Their definition of risk is in the vicinity of the likelihood of an exploit and the impact of the exploit as it impacts safety, essential performance, or patient harm. So kind of a compact definition there. But if you take a look at SW96 under their glossary 3.31 for risk, here they use the language of combination of the probability of occurrence of harm and the severity of that harm. And the word I'm calling attention to here is probability. And that's something that the FDA is leaning away from. They don't really want statistical probability, which is kind of what most people think of. that's sort of unacceptable in the context of the analysis here. They want really more sort of a proxy for the term might be exploitability or likelihood of a risk. Unpacking the term harm means, well, it includes data breach, system security, reduction of effectiveness. And maybe really the example I think of here is that if your system's been penetrated by some sort of Trojan attack and there's some sort of process running on it, it isn't doing any harm. It's sitting there, you know, is that harm? And I think by this definition it is. And lastly, the EU MDR has a really tight risk to them means combination of the probability of occurrence of harm and the severity of that harm. So it's kind of a simplified view of it. And so then the next thing I kind of want to take a look at is just sort of the considerations that you should have in mind when doing the threat modeling and the risk analysis. So the conditions that the FDA is expecting you to consider are things like different operating modes of the medical device. So by operating modes, that can be, for example, as the device is booting up, or if the device is in an error state. You know, you're expected to look at security in those modes because in those gaps, exploits can be found. Also, the software update process can also be somewhat extensive and non-trivial. They want you to consider scenarios when multiple patients can be harmed with one attack. Because of the multiplier effect there, that consideration gets a lot of attention, as well as scenarios where there are multiple users on your system. And of course, they want you to consider this not just, you know, once the product has been deployed, but across the entire life cycle. So that means even while in development, even while still in manufacturing, and of course, end of life and service and et cetera. They also want you to consider the environment that the medical device is used in, and you can envision the differences between, say, a doctor's office, sort of small, but maybe adjacent to other businesses, versus a clinic where you have you have maybe more players in the mix. A hospital, which is, of course, you know, a big, complex, multi-user environment, versus say an ambulance. And really what you're looking at here is sort of like a variation in the attackers across each of these environments. If your product is software as a medical device, that means that it could be running on different types of hardware and different types of operating systems. So that's another environmental consideration. And then, of course, you know, maybe first and foremost would be just connectivity. Whether the device is, as I call it, air-gapped, meaning it has no network, or if it's on a hospital network, where generally speaking, I would say that a hospital network should be considered pretty much a hostile environment. And lastly, sort of the intended use. You can envision the considerations would be drastically different if this is a device for, say, data acquisition for offline, non-real-time review versus something that's actually used by clinicians in immediate decision making. All right, so the steps we'll go through in our example that Colin's about to do. So a review of the system diagrams and intended functions, then a drawing of threat boundaries, and this is that diagram that sort of pulls things together that I was mentioning. Identifying assets, and then using the stride method to identify the threats, and then scores the safety impacts of the threats. And then step 6 would be identify the attack paths. And then that takes you to the point where you're ready to do the scoring of the feasibility or the difficulty of the attack paths, and then a further calculation for the overall risk score. And then comes the interesting part where you treat the threats with mitigations, and that can take multiple forms. You can, for example, transfer a threat to an end user. You can accept that threat as part of your business model, or you can choose to mitigate it or eliminate it. And that's where you determine the risk mitigation. And the order of 6 and 7 can be switched. It's not highly dependent there. So the STRIDE process, if you're not familiar with it, it's probably I would say the most common process used for this, but it's an acronym. With the acronym being the types of threats. So spoofing, where spoofing is pretending to be something or someone other than yourself. The intended property that the FDA wants you to strive for is basically authenticity, so that you can guarantee the endpoint. Tampering, which is kind of intuitive, modifying something on a disk, network, memory, or elsewhere. And what the FDA wants you to strive for is integrity of your system. So more or less as tested when leaving development. Repudiation, and this is a term meaning that basically the ability to pretend you didn't do something that you did. So claiming that you didn't do something or were not responsible. So the desired property there is just the opposite of that, to try to ensure that every action is traceable. And then information disclosure, which is basically someone obtaining information that they're not authorized to access. Again, the emphasis there on authorized, meaning roles. Denial of service, which is basically typically done by exhausting resources need to provide the service, where the desired property there is availability. And elevation of privilege, allowing someone to do something they're not authorized to do, again, back to roles and, yeah, basically the intended desired property that the FDA is looking for is authorization. All right, with that, I think I'll turn it over to Colin for the example.
Great, thanks, Milton. So we're going to use an example from the MITRE MDIC Threat Modeling Handbook. In there is a fictional device. I suspect many of you have looked at the handbook and may be familiar with this device. It's called AMPS. It's a ankle-worn predictor of stroke. And it is a nice example because it gives you the IoT embedded medical device this is the part that's worn on the ankle, that has a Bluetooth connection, which is used so often in medical devices, going to a smartphone, running the AMPS app. You have this interaction with the phone store to get updates, and then you're going off to the cloud and sending the results of the data to a cloud instance and infrastructure, and then having the doctor's computer logging in. So I think it covers all the bases. It's a very nice example that the folks from MITRE and MDIC came up with here. So as we go through our example, we're going to focus on this Bluetooth interface. We've got a couple of threats that we'll go through. So we've identified the asset. The next step is to identify the threat boundaries and the 10 steps that we showed on the previous slide, and we'll go back to that slide also. And we're basically saying that everything within the IoT device we're going to consider secure. So we're really trying to put security around the perimeter here and ideally go defense in depth. This is an interesting one because what's being applied here with the threat boundary being on the app is it's running on somebody's phone. So you don't have full control over security. So you need to do as much as you can. And the FDA will tell you you need to enable the owner of the device to add security that they need. And that is a couple of things. One is to make sure you have features that interact with the security on the phone. But the other is a good IFU, good instructions for use, and make it clear to the user what they need to do to make the device secure. And a lot of times you'll find a threat or a risk that you don't control, and you are going to have to transfer that. This is one of the options that Milton mentioned. So for an app running on a phone, or if it's SAMD a lot of times transference of risk is going to cover a lot of the threats that you have just because you're not in control of the security on the device. And then the cloud is, and there'll be a lot of security here in the cloud, ranging from role-based access control to, monitoring of activity on the different compute resources in the cloud. Okay, this is the man versus machine part. So Roman, I'm gonna turn it over to you. I'm gonna stop sharing here.
Great, sounds good. And so I will share first an example write-up of just more detail, sort of a description of a system that you might use as part of your input. So this is that same example system, the ankle monitor predictor of strokes. This comes from the MITRE Playbook. But we've removed the commentary that's in the playbook around the threats. We've removed the diagram showing the threat boundary. So this is really the subset of it that just describes how the system works and what its main components are. So the core use cases, the technology for what's in the component, an overall description of the device, the various sensors and components that exist at the device level, an overview of the patient application, how it communicates with the device and sends data to the cloud service itself, and how a clinician would access the portal through a web browser, and then the diagrams of the system showing a very high level one that are just the main three components: device, cell phone, app, cloud service. And then this is the diagram that you just saw Colin provide here, which shows the further detail and some connections showing the flow of data there. So it's about a 3-page description. Again, it's from the MITRE Playbook. And we want to put that as an input to an LLM-based tool that we're going to run in the background while Colin works through the example. And what this should hopefully allow us to do at the end is look at a more complete picture of what a threat and risk assessment would look like for that device. So I'm going to upload that document here. And what this tool is called MITRE. It is a LLM-powered threat and risk assessment tool. It uses the approach that Colin's going to follow through. This is a process that we put into place. It's a very systematic step-by-step process for going through the threat risk assessment. It's going to do that leveraging AI to help facilitate that, even including calculating the scores for both, attack exploitability and the overall risk calculation you would get from there that have the impacts of the damage scenarios as well. So that's going to upload that document. It takes, basically PDFs or image files with your descriptions. It'll parse and extract the information from existing documentation, including those diagrams to identify the figures, the data flow within the system. And then I'll just kick off the generate report. And so initially, the first things we'll get at here is just a very high-level summary of the design, a description of the system diagram, so we should see the main components. So this is the understanding of the main components that it has. And then it'll kick off from there, and it'll start doing the process that Colin's going to manually follow through. And then at the end of the webinar here, we'll come back and revisit the outputs and do a man versus machine comparison.
Thanks, Roman. And I'd just like to highlight that the machine has a head start here. So we'll have to take that into account at the end as we're rating how well I do. So we're going to bounce back and forth between the spreadsheet that we use and Roman referred to and this slide so we can track progress. And this is our spreadsheet. We developed this internally. It's our own spreadsheet at BG Networks. We've given it to customers. Customers use it, or medical device companies use it. We use it internally when we're helping customers with threat and risk assessments. Since we've launched MITRE, we're not going to be filling this out by hand very much going forward, I don't think. But I do think it is very valuable to understand the process and to go through the example that we have here, because it's going to give you a fundamental understanding about how to do threat modeling and risk assessment. The spreadsheet generates, like Milton said, information for 4 of the FDA documents that are required for eStar submission. It was specifically designed to be compliant with FDA's eStar. We also considered IEC 81001-5-1. That's the Secure Product Development Framework process that we follow. And also SW96, which Milton mentioned, which is a risk management process. Both that and 81001-5-1 are recognized FDA consensus standards. So we really work to make sure that this spreadsheet and the process that I'm going to show you here today meets FDA expectations. The FDA doesn't map this out in this sort of detail, so we kind of had to connect the dots ourselves. But one nice thing about the spreadsheet is if you follow it, and we're going to be kind of going to the right here, we'll be scrolling to the right on each of the tabs, and then we'll be clicking on the tabs to the right. So as I mentioned, like going to the right here, you're actually following a process that meets the expectations of the FDA. So now to get started with the assets, we'll do a couple here. We won't go through the entire second example because we won't have time, I don't think, given where we are in the webinar. But you want to define your assets. And we started that when we showed the MSPLOT diagram. And then actually, as you get into the threat modeling, you want to be very specific about the asset or any asset that could be affected somehow, some way in terms of cybersecurity. And it's something that you want to protect. Asset types, we have a drop-down list here. Include software, which this is what this asset is. We're saying in the AMPS device, again, the device that's worn, fictional device that's worn on somebody's ankle. It has firmware in it. It is essentially an embedded system. And that's the asset that we're going to consider a possible threat for. And then this one is data from the device. And we have or actually data from the app into the AMPS device. And if we can get through this example, you're going to see that it's a fuzzing attack causing denial of service is what we've queued up here. So, you're going to see with MITRE, there's going to be something on the order of 15 or so assets, maybe more. I forget right now. But you'll see that at the end. So you'll get a chance to look at the complete one. If you want the spreadsheet, just let us know. We'd be happy to send you the spreadsheet after the webinar. So just going back here. So we identified the assets. So the next thing is to use Stride. And there was a question about Stride. And it was really a good question that came in on the chat. And the point is it can be hard to use Stride. And the way that we think about Stride is that it helps us figure out what the threat should be. It's not the only thing that we rely on, but when you're trying to come up with the possible ways that an attacker could potentially threaten your design, it is helpful to go through each of these categories that Milton defined, spoofing through elevation of privilege, to consider how could the asset, in this case, the software in the embedded device, be impacted. And so the one that we've come up with here in the threat scenario, we considered it's a classic one, that it's spoofing and tampering. So if you start there, you think about spoofing, like how could this firmware be spoofed? Could it be changed? Could it be tampered with? And that's exactly what we came up with here. And this is the threat that we're going to go through, at least for the first example. The software control plane, the software in the device is attacked, and it's tampered with to give incorrect readings, which is probably one of the worst case scenarios for this device, given that it is a patient monitoring the device, and it's actually the generation of the data related to is the person related or at risk, for stroke. So if that data is incorrect, the device is really failing at its the function that it has. The damage scenario is exactly that. It's Incorrect data is presented to the physician, and the adverse consequence, which is again, probably the worst that this could have, is misdiagnosis. And then we get into the impact categories. And how do you rate this? And, Milton talked about context of use, and that really is important here. And it's important to know that this is a non-real-time device. It's worn for a period of weeks or months, and then the data is uploaded. So it's not like in an operating room where there's a instantaneous decision that has to be made. So that is a mitigating consideration when you come and look at these ratings categories. So we've got a drop down here, and we're not going to rate it severe. We're going to rate it major because of that reason, because it doesn't have this time critical, immediate immediacy of a decision to be made based on the data. And over here in the impact justification, you can follow along as I go through these impact categories. Financial is for the medical device company or the hospital. This is not for the FDA, but we find it extremely valuable for the medical device company and their customers to consider, is there legal implications? Is there possibility for incorrect treatments leading to some kind of financial penalties, probably through a lawsuit? And so we try to consider that, because those are security controls or risks that you want to mitigate with security controls if they are identified. And so in this case, we gave it a moderate. That's our second to just one above the lowest rating. Again, the non-real-time nature of the acquisition of the data, I think, mitigates that. Operationally, we said that this was severe because the device is not fulfilling at all its primary goal. And then privacy is negligible. The reason we put privacy in there is one way or the other, you will be thinking about privacy, about the information disclosure because of HIPAA or GDPR or other regulations. The FDA and a 510K is primarily looking for safety. They're not worried about the privacy aspect of things, but we do think it's important to consider that. And you do want to consider all security controls at once and not have to come back again later. So if you did separately and at a later time after an FDA to 510K submission, think about privacy. We think that's the wrong way to do it. So Roman, what do you think here? Is this good so far? Any comments?
Yes, and I would say that there is a tie-in with operational and privacy back to safety. So identifying them separately here doesn't mean they're not related. So if the operationally is a denial of service and the device is not being used, that can connect back into your safety and your hazard analysis you would do. What happens for a non-functional device? And then your privacy there is a potential connection there depending upon what information is disclosed, as well as that private PHI data that is disclosed could have an impact on somebody's ability to get insurance. So there is a connection there, and it'll depend upon the hazard analysis that you're doing. So I think it's always important to consider all of these categories and have a holistic view around it, and then tie it all back to safety as part of the final submission to the FDA, because that's ultimately what they're going to be looking at.
Great. Thank you, Roman. And I'm seeing that you're kind of giving your extended comments to slow me down, so my results are going to be worse versus ITRA, I think. So.
I was going to raise that. I was going to mention that, yeah.
You noticed it too, Milton, I see.
Yeah.
And anything to gain an advantage here.
That's right. We'll go to the next tab here, which is the risk analysis. So now that we've got the impacts, the damage scenario and impacts and threats, and that's typically what we put into the document around threat modeling into a 510K. This tab is what goes into the risk assessment document, typically what we do. We've got we have our own secure product development framework templates. This is something that we sell. If you didn't have an SPDF in place and those templates, that's something we'd be happy to discuss. But we've broken it up that way between the threat modeling document that goes into eStar and the risk assessment. It's essentially between these two tabs right here. So the spreadsheet automatically populates from the previous slide, the threat and the damage. So now we're going to go to the attack path. And this attack path is one where the attacker would obtain the device, for instance, off of eBay, the AMPS device. They could extract the code using a JTAG interface, reverse compile the code. That is surprisingly easy to do. There's a tool, believe it or not, from the NSA that they released called GIDRA, and it reverse compiles binaries for many, many different types of processors. And so it's very easy to get access to the source code. That then gives the attacker the opportunity to inspect over time the source code, make changes to it, and essentially design in an exploit into the software, and then perform a software update. And what the attacker would try to do is perform that software update as widely as possible to affect as many devices as possible. That would have the highest kind of impact from an adversary's point of view. The FDA calls that multi-patient harm, and that's one of the 4 architectural diagrams that Milton talked about, and something that they're very keenly looking at to make sure that there isn't a significant threat or risk that hasn't been mitigated related to multi-patient harm. And when we do the threat and risk assessment, and just a tip, for setting the context of, if you're using our spreadsheet or if you're doing your own, we always assume that there's no security controls in place. So in this case, we're assuming that there's no protections in a software update. Almost anybody who has a software update already has some level of security on there, but that's okay. Assume that you don't when you're doing the threat and risk assessment would be our recommendation, because then it's going to be a very complete threat and risk assessment. It's going to lead to the documentation of the fact that you put in the software update, given a specific sort of threat and risk, and it's just going to flow right into your documentation, and then it's going to check the box or address the issue that the FDA has, which already you're going to need secure software updates for your medical devices.
Yeah. And ideally, a threat and risk assessment is done at the very beginning when you're defining your overall requirements, and that would include the security requirements that would come out of a threat and risk assessment. But of course, threat and risk assessments can happen at many different stages of a design. And so we still take the approach of assuming the security isn't there, because it will help justify that you have the right level of security that's actually needed for those threats.
Then in terms of elapsed time, you need to think about how difficult the attack is. This is not an easy one to perform, but we said 4 months. You need an expert. You need what we consider sensitive knowledge of the target. What that means is information that's not readily available. In this case, you're reverse compiling the code. The window of opportunity is easy because the attacker can buy the device off eBay, bring it to their lab, spend as much time as they need. And the equipment we have listed here is bespoke. And so this is the way we actually rank the exploitability of the attack. And that's the key word. If you're talking about attack paths, talk about exploitability. The FDA loves to hear that. And it's essentially the difficulty of the attack. And in this case, it's a kind of a mid-range attack difficulty. We don't use CVSS because of 2 reasons. CVSS doesn't consider safety, and you're going to see in a moment when we rate risk, we'll be considering the damage scenarios, the impacts, the safety. The other reason is CVSS doesn't change. CVSS score is meant to be static. It basically says, here is, if this was exploited, the risk of this attack. You put in the security control, you want the risk to come down, and that's the whole process here, and that's critical to this process, and that's what we're going to show you here right now. So when we consider, and I'm going to just move quickly here because we only have 10 minutes left, the overall impact we said was severe from the previous tab, so that's related to safety. The exploitability of the difficulty of the attack is moderate. So now you have a risk of 4. That's second from the most severe risk. And like Milton talked about before, you can decide what to do about this, but this is something that we're going to have to mitigate. The risk is high. This is not something that can be transferred. So we're going to need some security controls to address this. And there's 2 that we came up with. One is an easy one to implement, which is, not so easy, but I was thinking about a JTAG control, but this encryption in code in Flash so that it can't be reverse engineered. We put this one in here because a lot of times people think encryption is to protect privacy of information, but in this case, it makes it more difficult to actually perform the attack because the attacker can't reverse engineer the code. They can't figure out how to put the exploit in the code. The other is having a secure software update with cryptographic authenticity and integrity checks. So those are the couple of controls we have in place. We don't show it here, but you'd actually go back again and re-rate the risk with our spreadsheet. And in this case, putting those couple of things in place is going to bring this risk value down to a 2 or a 1. So it's going to end up being a very low or a low, and that's going to be acceptable to the FDA. All of a sudden, you've taken this threat around the code being tampered with in the AMPS device, taken the risk from a 4 down to something that's acceptable by these security controls. So the nice thing about a threat risk assessment is it essentially tells you what security you should be putting in place. You don't want to put in security controls for things that had a low risk. There's no need for that. That's extra time and effort for your engineers to put that in. So that's a nice outcome also of the threat risk assessment.
Roman, there was a related question that came in around, how likely is physical tampering of devices? And I think you sort of covered it here in this example because attackers will absolutely get a hold of a device and they will physically get into that device to see what they can extract from it in terms of that process. So is secure boot methods needed? Do you need a hardware of trust? It may depend on the device. In this case, it's a Bluetooth component. It's pretty easy to get access to. If you have more physical controls or it's in a controlled environment, your requirement level for the secure boot process you might put as your security control, that will be dependent upon your device and the environment that it's working in there. But you absolutely need to consider threats against kind of physical interface of your device. Attackers will absolutely go after them.
Roman, so that is what I had there. And sorry for not jumping back to this. I meant to track, but we went through all these steps here, 1 through 10. And Roman, I'm going to turn it back over to you. So
I will share my screen and we'll see where MITRE is at, and it's finished. Here we go. So here's the output, and it's really going to show all the steps that we talked about there. And I thought what might be useful here to go through is pick up another example. So anything that MITRE produces certainly needs to be reviewed, but that reviewing to make sure the output is correct is much more efficient to be able to accomplish there. So roughly here, you'll see it's identified about 39 assets. I will try to find one here related to the communication stack. So asset 22, that's the communication stack for your Bluetooth connectivity with the AMPS device. And so I'm going to look for that in the remaining steps here to see if we can identify some of the threats against it. Here's the threat scenarios and the STRIDE analysis done for that. Here's asset 22. So we're looking at, again, this is another common attack, which is spoofing attacks against a communication stack. So Bluetooth, it's an open connection between a device and the stack. Definitely a target for attackers to be looking at. In this case, we're looking at intercepting or altering data in that transmission. So it's not only spoofing, but it's potentially getting into their tampering with data or information disclosure, being able to intercept that data. And so we'll go from there. We have the damage scenarios. One of these damage scenarios will be related to the Bluetooth stack as well. Trying to scroll through and quickly look for that. I guess I could just search for Bluetooth so we can see that example. That might be faster. Okay, so we have, no, not the one. Okay, we've jumped ahead here. So damage scenario 16. So that's the threat scenario we were looking at. And it's looking at how can you intercept that? Well, it really just requires a rogue Bluetooth device to be able to intercept that data. So you have to have a device near the AMPS device, and you can initiate an unauthorized pairing or spoofing to that device. And then you can essentially do a man-in-the-middle attack against that. So for that attack path, in terms of, there'll be a rating, of course, of the exploitability here. Bluetooth, there's a lot of tools available here, standard off-the-shelf tools you can use to intercept data. So it's actually a pretty easy attack to be able to intercept data if you don't have any security protections. And again, that's our assumption. So when that comes down to what is the risk controls for that, we would find down here, well, Bluetooth enables both encryption and authentication as part of the process there. So you can combine those to be able to mitigate the potential damage you can have from that. And so that's sort of the analysis. It identified 39 different sort of risk entries where there is some mitigation recommendations that could be considered for that implementation. The output of this is essentially a download, which would be a spreadsheet that matches the flow of information that Colin was manually doing earlier.
Pretty good performance, man versus machine. Quite an impressive tool.
I did one, and it did, I don't know, 65.
39.
That's a pretty good ratio.
So should we go through some of the questions? We've got a couple of minutes left here.
We should, yes.
So I'm addressing one here. I started to type it in. The question was about hardware root of trust, best practice, or device specific. My first thought on that is that, put it through the threat model and risk analysis, given the context of your device. And if the risk comes out to be very low or low, you've got a great explanation for the FDA why you don't put in a hardware root of trust. The second thought there is that it's not only protecting against physical tampering, it also protects against modifications of code, because you're always checking on reset against that hardware root of trust. The hardware could be a hash that's burnt into a fixed memory location like an OTP. That can't be changed by software. And when you reset the device, it's part of one of the 8 security control categories, resilience and recovery, that if you have secure boot, it's checking that, hardware root of trust, which could be a hash in, like I said, OTP. Then you know that after reset, the device is going to come up in a state that's authentic and has integrity. So it can also help, if there are attacks on your code that is, remote. And, the embedded processors these days, they have it all built in, or if you're making, using an off-the-shelf PC or embedded computer or something, they have TPMs in there and software TPMs. There's a lot that you can use, and it's not too bad actually to implement these days. So.
And I see there was a question that came in here on, can you use the exploitability term in CVSS? So we don't use CVSS for scoring. There's a few reasons for that. One is that CVSS it's mixing both sort of that exploitability scoring aspects to it, but it's also mixing in the score the impacts that you get out of it on confidentiality, availability, integrity. And it's trying to combine those together to give you one overall score. For our risk assessment, we want to separate the impact from the exploitability for those attack paths. And so what we wanted to identify is what is a good way to evaluate attack exploitability. So we've based this on a standard. It's an ISO standard 18045-2022, which has this method of evaluating the attack path exploitability. The other benefit of doing that is when you have your risk controls in place and you're evaluating how well those controls have reduced your risk, lowered your risk to ideally an appropriate level, is you can reevaluate, given the security control you have in place, what is the attack exploitability? So if I use CVSS, that attack exploitability, the score doesn't really change much in terms of what's required to do the attack. But if you look at it from looking at the knowledge and the tooling and the other impacts, that scoring will change based upon your risk controls that you put in place, and then you can look at the overall lowered risk. So I'd see those are a few of the advantages of using this approach from the ISO 18045 standard compared to using CVSS for trying to evaluate the attack exploitability.
Roman, was there another question here about CIA? Or maybe, yeah, using it in place of L1, L2 controls. Yeah, you can consider confidentiality, integrity, availability. We've done it before. We've had some customers that wanted us to use that instead of Stride. And you can generate the threats based on CIA, if that is preferred.
I would, yeah, just to comment on that, Stride does it. It doesn't specifically say this threat is for confidentiality. It looks at the threat as what does the threat do that would affect confidentiality. So confidentiality is the principle that you want to keep your data confidential. And the threat to that is information disclosure. So there is a mapping from each of the CIA to the Stride categories, but Stride also includes other things that CIA doesn't.
And just, I know we're running out of time. I put my email in the chat. If people do want the spreadsheet, they can email me. Well, I guess it's in the question and answer. And another one was, what's the difference between this tool and the Microsoft threat modeling tool? The Microsoft threat modeling tool, what you need to do is create diagrams. You need to create templates, essentially objects that go into the tool that have descriptions about threats and potential, kind of mitigations to those threats. And you have to draw it out. It takes a long time. Part of the reason we created iThreat was exactly so you did not have to use the Microsoft threat modeling tool anymore. And it's like Roman said, you were just taking an existing document that describes your system that doesn't have any security information in it. You drag and drop it over, and you could see, as we demonstrated here, within 15 minutes, you get the very complete threat and risk assessment done. Whereas we think it's over 100 hours of work for a system like this one, like the AMPS model, if you were going to go and do it by hand, or you either using our spreadsheet or drawing it out with the Microsoft threat and risk analysis tool.
I think that may be a good time to wrap up. I think we hit most of the questions, but is there anything else, Roman, that you see in there that you want to make sure we answer? I mean, folks are hanging with us, so if there's any more, we could probably answer one more question.
Oh, great question. I mean, there was generally a question on penetration testing. I don't think we have time to get into the details there, but I'll just comment on the connection between penetration testing and threat and risk assessment. It's sort of another point where you'd have to go back and revisit your threat and risk assessment. Your pen testing may identify new threats you hadn't already considered. And so that then has to be put back into this process of evaluating the exploitability, the risk, what controls you have in place there, how do you mitigate them, and then documenting and following that process there. Happy to, of course, jump on a call with anybody to get more into details on pen testing as well.
Thank you so much. That was fantastic. So Janelle, Roman, Colin, Milton, excellent presentation. Thank you so much for walking us through that. And thank you to all of you attendees for sticking with us for a couple extra minutes. Actually, it shows you're very engaged with the topic. So we'd love to do more on this type of thing. As we mentioned at the beginning, if you have registered, you will receive a video presentation of this. And I hope you'll join me in thanking ICS and BG Networks, and reach out to these obviously experts for some really in-depth perspective.
So thank you all, and I hope to see you all soon at another Mass Medic webinar. Have a great day.
Thank you, everyone.
Take care. Thanks, Rachel.